In the quiet countryside of the Roman Republic, and later the vast Roman Empire, life began not with swords or discipline, but with the rhythmic clinking of tools in the fields. For the majority of Roman boys, their first experiences with labor were not military drills, but farm work. Day after day, they helped their fathers sow seeds, gather olives, prune grapevines, and feed animals. A Roman farm boy's world was small: his home, a patch of land, his family, and his local village or town. There were no grand expectations of glory in battle or speeches about defending Rome. Instead, their future was shaped by the dirt under their fingernails and the steady monotony of rural labor. But beneath the surface of this peaceful life, there was always one looming possibility: conscription or enlistment into the Roman army. Military service was not always voluntary. In the early Republic, Rome relied heavily on conscription. Citizens were expected to serve when called, and the criteria for who could be recruited were often tied to land ownership. Wealthier men were expected to serve as cavalry, while poorer men, like most farmers, served as infantry. So a boy from a humble background would almost always be destined for the front lines. As the empire expanded and professionalized its military under leaders like Gaius Marius, things shifted. The army began to recruit from the capite censi, the headcount, those with no property at all. Suddenly, any able-bodied man could be swept into service. What was once a temporary duty became a career. A very long, very demanding, and very dangerous career. The process of joining up wasn't dramatic. A young man might hear that a recruiter was coming to a nearby town. Or word might spread that a new legion was forming to head off to Gaul or Syria. For some, the army offered a way out of poverty, a chance at regular meals, a tiny wage, and maybe, eventually, land. For others, it was simply what was expected. Their father served, their uncles served, and now it was their turn. Upon arriving at the recruitment center, often a dusty outpost or a makeshift tent near a marketplace, the would-be soldier was assessed. Roman recruiters looked for certain qualities: strong arms, solid legs, good teeth, a healthy chest. The ideal soldier was a farmer's son, already toughened by years of labor. If the young man passed inspection, he swore an oath of loyalty, the sacramentum. From that moment on, his life was no longer his own. Training began immediately. The first days were the worst. New recruits were stripped of their civilian clothes and given coarse tunics. Their hair was cut short, sometimes shaved entirely. The message was clear: forget your past. You belong to Rome now. The barracks were bare and uncomfortable. Stone or wooden floors with thin mattresses if you were lucky. You slept alongside other recruits, none of whom you knew, and most of whom smelled like sweat and dust. The scent of military life was inescapable: old leather, unwashed feet, and dried sweat soaked into linen. The first phase of training focused on discipline. Soldiers were not born, they were made, through repetition and exhaustion. A typical day might begin before sunrise. The recruits would be woken by trumpet blasts, forced out of their bunks, and lined up in perfect formation. Then came the marching. Miles and miles of it. In full gear, under the sun, across rocky terrain. No talking. No slouching. Just the sound of sandals hitting the ground. After marching came weapons training. Not with real swords at first, but with heavy wooden ones, that were deliberately made twice as heavy. If you could fight with that, you could fight with anything. Recruits practiced thrusting, blocking, parrying, over and over, until their arms trembled. They trained against wooden posts called polli, mimicking the shape of an enemy. The soldier's goal was simple: muscle memory. In battle, they wouldn't have time to think. They had to react. Then there were the drills. Endless formations. Learning to move as one unit, not as individuals. Left turn, right turn, testudo formation, wedge formation. March in step. Stop on command. Charge in unison. The centurions shouted constantly, their voices hoarse from years of barking orders. Anyone who lagged behind was punished. Push-ups in the mud, carrying heavy stones, Or worse, public humiliation in front of the whole cohort. Meals were short and simple. A chunk of bread. Maybe a spoonful of porridge. Occasionally some cheese or olives. Meat was rare. Food was fuel, not pleasure. The army didn't care if you liked it. You ate quickly, cleaned your bowl, and got back to work. For many, homesickness was a quiet torment. A recruit might go years without seeing his family again. Letters were rare and unreliable. Some boys clung to small tokens, a carved wooden figure, a scrap of cloth, a pebble from the family farm. Others shut those feelings down completely. Survival meant focusing on the present. As the weeks wore on, the recruits changed. Their shoulders broadened. Their steps became more deliberate. They stopped flinching at shouted commands. What began as a chaotic group of frightened boys slowly turned into something resembling a military unit. Uniform, obedient, and hardened. After training, they were assigned to legions. Each legion had its own number, history, and insignia. Some were prestigious, others infamous. A recruit might find himself sent to the cold edges of Britannia, the deserts of Numidia, or the forests of Germania. Where you went wasn't your choice. The Empire decided. You obeyed. From this point forward, the routine was relentless. Wake, drill, march, maintain weapons, guard duty, repeat. Soldiers weren't just warriors. They were builders, engineers, and manual laborers. They constructed roads, bridges, and fortifications. They dug ditches and cleared forests. All under the watchful eye of their centurions, who rarely smiled. At night, the barracks were filled with muffled snores, whispered prayers, and the occasional sound of a soldier crying softly into his blanket. The army didn't break you in dramatic ways. It wore you down slowly, predictably, day after day. And yet, some soldiers grew to find comfort in the routine. The predictability, the structure, the sense of purpose. For men who came from chaotic or impoverished homes, the army offered a strange form of stability. Even if it was dull. Even if it was hard. This was the life of a Roman soldier before the battles. Not glory. Not triumph. But transition. From a boy on a farm to a man in formation. And it was only just beginning. It always began with the sound of the tuba, a long brass trumpet blaring just before dawn. No words. Just a shrill, echoing command that vibrated through the bones, and pulled soldiers from their sleep like a rough hand on the shoulder. You didn't ask where you were going. You just got up. The Roman Empire was vast. From the cool, gray hills of Britannia to the arid deserts of Egypt, from the Rhine in the north to the Euphrates in the east, it stretched across 3 continents. And for all the reach of its power, there was no convenient way to move troops. No carts for the common soldier. No horses unless you were cavalry. Just your 2 feet, your sandals, and the endless road ahead. The Via, Rome's famous roads, were marvels of engineering. Paved with stone, crowned for drainage, and lined with milestones, they were built for marching legions. But that didn't make the journey any easier. Each soldier carried about 50 to 60 pounds of gear, a gladius, short sword, a pilum, javelin, a shield, a helmet, body armor, rations, cookware, a cloak, and a wooden stake for building the nightly camp palisade. They were walking war machines, burdened from head to toe. This massive bundle was called the sarcina. It was tied to a long pole, and slung over the shoulder like a cross. Every step with the sarcina felt like hauling a bundle of bricks. The leather straps dug into skin, the helmet bounced with every step, and the heat pulled under armor plates. Sweat soaked through tunics before the sun even cleared the horizon. The marching pace was set by the centurion's command, and the beat of a drum. Roughly 20 Roman miles per day, about 18 modern ones, on flat terrain. That's around 30 kilometers. Uphill, through forests, or in rough country, the pace slowed. But it rarely stopped. A legion in motion was expected to keep moving, no matter the weather, no matter the terrain. Sandals, called calig, were not meant for comfort. They were tough, made of leather, with hobnails hammered into the soles to grip the road. After a few miles, those nails began to feel like stones underfoot. Blisters were constant companions. So were bruised toenails, twisted ankles, and sore knees. Some soldiers packed rags into their calig for extra padding. Others simply endured. The column stretched for miles. Officers rode horses. Supply wagons creaked and groaned near the rear. The front ranks kept a measured rhythm, but it didn't take much to throw everything off. One soldier tripping could ripple down the line like a wave. The punishment for breaking formation was usually a shouted insult, a sharp slap with the vine staff of a centurion, or being assigned to latrine duty at camp. Meals on the road were eaten cold and quickly. Dried hardtack, barley, cheese, or if you were lucky, some olives. Water was stored in animal skin flasks that smelled like whatever creature had last worn them. Soldiers scooped up water from streams, filtering it through a rag or not at all. Clean drinking water wasn't guaranteed. Diarrhea and dysentery followed many legions like shadows. Silence was often enforced. Marching wasn't supposed to be a social hour. You moved in step, you listened, and you followed. Conversation, laughter, or singing was discouraged unless it came from higher up. Some commanders allowed marching songs, or chants to keep morale up. Others viewed such behavior as undisciplined. The mood varied by legion, but most marched in quiet focus. The worst part wasn't the weight, or the dust, or the pain in the legs. It was the monotony. Every tree began to look the same. Every village blurred into the next. The same view, the same sounds, the same discomfort. 4 hours. 4 days. 4 weeks. And then, just before dusk, you'd arrive. Not to rest, but to build a camp. Every night, Roman soldiers built fortified encampments from scratch. First came the ditch, dug in hard-packed soil, sometimes by torchlight. Then the palisade, formed from the stakes each man carried. Gates were installed, watchtowers built, and tents set up in strict formation. It didn't matter how tired you were. You dug. You lifted. You followed orders. Then you ate, if you had anything left. Bread dipped in vinegar water. A few beans. Maybe dried fruit. Some soldiers saved bits of sausage or smoked meat from local traders, but most meals were bland, barely filling, and eaten in the dirt. Afterward, if you weren't on guard duty, you collapsed into your tent. 8 men to a tent. Cramped, hot in summer, freezing in winter. The air thick with sweat and damp wool. You lay there, listening to the grumbling stomachs, the coughing, the snores. Your feet throbbed. Your back ached. And you knew that at first light, it would all start again. If the legion was lucky, they might stay in one place for several days. But more often, the marching continued without pause. Rome's military strategy relied on mobility and presence. A legion that stood still too long grew complacent. Or worse, forgot who was in charge. So the feet kept moving. Always forward. Marches across entire provinces were not uncommon. From Gaul to Hispania, from Moesia to Judea, some legions walked thousands of kilometers over their 20-year careers. Their feet bore the weight of Rome's ambitions. Their knees ground down like old stones. Their backs curved under years of burdens. Veteran soldiers could be identified by their gait alone. A slow, rolling walk. Legs slightly bowed. Ankles stiff. Every step the echo of thousands before. Some limped permanently. Others developed calluses so thick they no longer felt the ground beneath them. And yet, despite the fatigue, Roman soldiers took a strange pride in their marching. They believed it separated them from weaker armies. From undisciplined barbarians. From pampered citizens. Marching was proof of endurance. Of order. Of Rome's unyielding will. Still, pride didn't ease the blisters. Or prevent sunburn. Or stop snow from creeping into your boots. It didn't make the road shorter. Or the nights warmer. It just kept you going. The endless march was not glorious. It was not noble. It was not memorable. It was the background noise of empire. The rhythm of thousands of feet beating stone. Again and again and again. Let's begin with the truth that every Roman soldier knew deep in his grumbling, empty stomach. The army didn't feed you to make you happy. It fed you just enough to keep your legs moving, and your sword arm strong. And it did so in the least exciting, least flavorful, and most repetitive way possible. The food of a Roman soldier was not a feast. It was a calculation. Picture yourself in a Roman marching camp. The sun is setting. Your feet ache. You've spent the day hauling your body, your armor, and a bundle of sharpened sticks across 20 miles of dry, rocky terrain. You've built a ditch, dug the camp, raised the palisade, and now you're ready for dinner. Except dinner is waiting in your pack. And it's the same thing you ate yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. Welcome to the world of cibus militaris, the food of Roman soldiers. The staple of the Roman military diet was grain. Mostly wheat, sometimes barley. But not as bread you might recognize. There was no neat, fluffy loaf wrapped in linen. There were no bakeries rolling out hot baguettes on the frontier. You were the bakery. You were also the miller, the cook, the dishwasher, and the waiter. Each soldier received a ration of grain, often around 1.5 kilograms per day. That sounds generous. Until you realize that it came in the form of raw, unprocessed grain. Not flour. Not meal. Not porridge. Just grain. Little hard kernels of wheat or barley, often full of dust, chaff, or even tiny insects. So, what did you do? You ground it yourself. Every tent of 8 men carried a quern, a small, portable hand mill made of stone. It took hours to grind enough flour for the group. Your arms would ache before you ever lit the fire. Once ground, the flour was mixed with water. No yeast. No baking soda. No salt if you'd run out. You shaped the lump into a flat cake, maybe slapped it on a hot stone, or cooked it in the ashes of a fire. This was panis militaris, soldier's bread. Dense, chewy, slightly smoky, and about as fun to eat as a dry sponge. To call it bland would be generous. Most soldiers chewed in silence, focused more on swallowing than savoring. But they ate it because they had to. It gave them energy. It filled the stomach. And it kept them alive. Sometimes the bread was replaced with a gruel, pulse. This was the Roman soldier's version of oatmeal. Mix grain with water. Boil it. Stir. Add some vinegar if you had it. Maybe toss in a chopped onion or dried herb. That's it. It wasn't a celebration of flavor. It was a fuel. The result was a thick, grayish mush that stuck to your spoon, your fingers, and occasionally your soul. Now and then, the army issued other rations. Salted pork or bacon was a prized addition. These came in heavy slabs, cured to last for months, even in the heat. The meat was often tough and incredibly salty. Soldiers might boil it to soften it, or fry it, if they had oil, though oil was scarce in the north. One thing it never was: juicy. It was meat in the technical sense. But it didn't melt in your mouth. It chewed back. Cheese, when available, came in hard wheels or waxy lumps that could last for weeks. It was often goat or sheep cheese, sharp and crumbly. Not something you'd melt over a pizza. More like something you'd shave off in slivers and gnaw with effort. Still, it was high in fat. It added flavor. And in the long days of marching and cold nights, fat was your best friend. Legions sometimes had access to vinegar wine, posca. This was not a treat. It was not refreshing. It was sour, acidic, and often unpleasant. But mixed with water, it helped purify dirty streams. And it did something remarkable: it made you thirstier. So you drank more. And stayed hydrated. Sort of. When stationed near towns or settled areas, soldiers might buy additional items. Dried fruits, nuts, garlic, onions, olives, lentils, and even local wine. Some legions grew their own gardens. But this was a luxury. Foremost on the march, meals were identical from day to day. Bread, porridge, meat if lucky, cheese if very lucky. Pasco, always. Food poisoning was common. There were no expiration dates. No refrigeration. Meat turned. Cheese molded. Water spoiled. Soldiers ate it anyway. Hunger is persuasive. Then there were the feast days. Official celebrations. Victories. Emperors' birthdays. These were rare but special. The army might slaughter cattle. Distribute fresh bread. Allow local vendors into camp. Soldiers might taste honey, figs, or fresh fish. And then it was back to barley and water. Some soldiers got creative. They bartered with locals. Caught fish or rabbits. Picked wild herbs. If they could cook, they became popular tent mates. If they couldn't, they stuck to mush and silence. Food was not just fuel, it was also politics. Officers got better meals. Access to kitchens. Wine. Proper cutlery. While common soldiers boiled lentils over smoky fires, their commanders dined on roasted meats and imported olives. Rank had its privileges. And in the Roman army, your stomach reminded you of your place. One thing is certain, hunger was a constant. The food was never quite enough. The portions carefully measured to avoid waste, and to remind soldiers they were tools, not guests. You ate to fight. You didn't fight to eat. And when the day ended, and the tent fell into silence, the last sound many soldiers heard was the quiet chewing of their brothers in arms. Chewing hard bread. Scraping out the bottom of a porridge pot. Sipping sour vinegar water. Dreaming, if they were lucky, of olives and honey and hot meals. Meals they might never taste again. If you were a Roman soldier, training wasn't something you did to prepare for war. Training was the war. It was never ending. Monotonous. Repetitive. Painful. The kind of routine that made your arms sore, your feet blistered, and your spirit dull. But the Roman military believed this brutal repetition was the secret to survival. And they were right. From the moment you were recruited, the Roman military stripped you of your former identity. You were no longer a farmer, a shepherd, or a runaway. You were a Miles, a soldier. And your new life started with discipline. Endless, grinding, soul-numbing discipline. The typical day began before dawn. You'd wake up to the sound of a horn, harsh, sharp, and impossible to ignore. There were no snooze buttons. No excuses. No late mornings. Whether the sky was raining, freezing, or baking with heat, you rolled out of your tent onto the hard ground, stretched your aching back, and lined up. Always in formation. Always on time. The first drill was usually marching. Sounds easy. But not Roman marching. You'd cover miles of terrain, gravel roads, dirt tracks, river banks, uphill paths, loaded down with full gear. That meant your armor, your weapons, your tools, your rations, your tent poles. All of it, bundled in a pack slung over your shoulders. Easily weighing 40 kilograms or more. You carried the weight of your life, literally. The Roman military even had a term for these soldiers, Marius mules. Because they carried nearly as much as a mule. And marched just as far. After the morning march, you practiced ordines, formations. Line up. Move as one. Turn on command. Hold the line. Pivot left. Advance. Retreat. Stop. Do it again? The point wasn't just to learn the moves, it was to forget your instincts. A Roman soldier didn't act on impulse. He obeyed. Instantly. Without hesitation. Then came weapons training. You practiced with a wooden sword, twice the weight of the real thing. The idea was that if you mastered the heavy version, the actual blade would feel light in combat. These practice swords were swung again and again against wooden posts, poly. You'd strike, recover, strike again. 100 times. 200, until your shoulders felt like they might tear from the bone. The shield drill came next. You learned to hold your scutum, a heavy curved shield, at exactly the right angle. You raised it overhead. You locked it beside your neighbor's shield. You crouched under it like a turtle in the famous testudo formation. And then you held it. 4 minutes. Then hours. Your arms trembled. Sweat dripped into your eyes. But you held. Then came javelin practice. The Roman pilum was designed to pierce enemy shields, and then bend. That way, enemies couldn't throw it back. You had to learn to hurl it with just the right force, just the right angle. Over and over again. On command. Until the motion was muscle memory. But there was more. You trained in swimming rivers. Building camps. Digging trenches. Erecting palisades. Throwing stones. Scaling walls. Loading catapults. Setting ambushes. Marching in silence. Marching in noise. Enduring heat. Enduring cold. Enduring everything. Your body itched. Your hands blistered. Your feet cracked. But if you fell behind, there was punishment. Sometimes public humiliation. Sometimes beatings. The centurion carried a stick, not just for pointing, but for striking. If you slacked, you felt it. On your back. On your ribs. On your pride. And that stick had a name, the vitus. It was a symbol of authority. But for most soldiers, it was the constant reminder that you were always one mistake away from pain. Now imagine doing this not for a week, not for a month, but for 25 years. Because that's how long your service lasted. 25 years of training. Of drills. Of formations. Of bruises. In peacetime, it never stopped. If there were no battles to fight, the army invented work. You built roads. Bridges. Forts. You dug moats that no one ever used. You practiced scaling walls you built yourself. Just to tear them down and rebuild them again. It wasn't just training the body, it was training the will. The Romans believed that a soldier should suffer more in training than in battle. That discipline saved lives. And so they repeated the same motions, until even dreams felt like drills. Every movement was drilled to the beat of the cornu, the long, curled Roman war horn. Its blaring notes told you when to turn, when to stop, when to march, when to run. In the heat of battle, the sound of that horn cut through chaos. And your body obeyed before your brain did. The rhythm of military life was unnatural. You didn't rise and fall with the sun, you rose with the horn. You didn't walk when tired, you walked when ordered. You didn't fight for glory, you fought because it was expected. And at the end of the day, after all the drills, the bruises, the blisters, the shouting, the lifting, the swinging, the stabbing, you were allowed to sleep. On the hard ground. With a cloak as a blanket. A shield as a door. Surrounded by snoring men and creaking tents. And in the quiet of that darkness, you prepared yourself to do it all again. Tomorrow. And the next day. And every day for the next 2 decades. If you've ever worn a tight shirt on a hot day, and felt like you were melting, imagine that feeling multiplied by 100. Then add 30 extra pounds of metal. And leather. And wool. That's what it felt like to be dressed for duty as a Roman soldier. The armor didn't just protect you, it punished you. Every day began the same way. After waking up stiff and sore from sleeping on the ground, you pulled on the first layer, a coarse wool tunic. It scratched your skin and soaked up sweat like a sponge. But it was all you had. Then came the belt, actually 2 belts, decorated with metal studs and dangling leather straps. These weren't for fashion. They clinked and jangled as you walked, reminding you, and everyone around you, that you were armed. Next came the real burden, the armor. The most famous was the lorica segmentata, a series of iron plates riveted together, wrapping around the torso like a segmented shell. It looked impressive. But wearing it was another story. It was heavy. It was stiff. It pinched your shoulders and dug into your collarbone. And if it wasn't fitted just right, it shifted with every step. To secure it, you needed help. You couldn't fasten all the leather straps and buckles by yourself. So soldiers dressed each other. Every morning. Like clanking, sweating children helping one another into iron pajamas. Underneath the iron plates, you might wear a padded vest to soften the blow of incoming weapons. But that padding also trapped heat. In summer, it was like wrapping your torso in steaming bread dough, and then baking it in the sun. In winter, it froze solid with sweat. And the armor didn't stop there. You wore greaves, metal shin guards, that strapped over your legs. They rubbed raw against your skin during long marches. Some soldiers wore manica, an armored sleeve on the sword arm. It protected against slashes, but it also restricted movement. Then there was the helmet Galea. Made of iron or bronze, it wrapped around your head like a metal bowl. It had cheek guards that pressed your face, a neck guard that poked your spine, and sometimes a nasal ridge that left a permanent dent in your nose bridge. Inside, a leather lining tried, usually failed, to make it comfortable. Imagine wearing all this every day, while walking for miles, while training in the sun, while hauling gear, pitching tents, digging trenches. The armor didn't come off unless your centurion said so. Even when it rained, even when it steamed, even when the sweat pooled in your boots. And about those boots, Roman calig were not soft leather slippers. They were hobnailed sandals, thick soles with iron studs hammered into the bottom. Great for traction, awful for comfort. Marching in them tore up your feet. The nails wore through the sole over time, pressing up into your heels. No arch support. No socks. Just you, your leather straps, and the road. Now add weapons to this loadout. First, the gladius, a short, stabbing sword. About 18 to 24 inches long. It hung on your right side. Its sharp edge rubbed against your thigh with every step. You also carried a pugio, a dagger strapped to your belt. And 2 pila, heavy javelins. One was light for distance. One was heavy, for armor piercing. They dug into your shoulder as you walked. And then came the scutum, the Roman shield. Massive, curved, rectangular. It was made of wood, covered in leather, and edged in metal. It weighed about 10 kilograms. You slung it over your back, or carried it on your left arm. Either way, it wore you down. Now pile on the rest. Your personal kit included a cloak, a mess tin, a water flask, a bag of grain, cooking gear, a shovel or pickaxe, and your share of the tent. All bundled into a pack. All strapped onto a pole. All carried by you. By the time you were fully equipped, you resembled a walking siege engine. Heavily armed. Completely miserable. And this wasn't ceremonial. You wore this gear every time you were on the move. Marching through Gaul. Climbing through the Alps. Patrolling the desert in Syria. The armor cooked you in summer and froze you in winter. It never adjusted to the weather. You adjusted to it. But worst of all was what it did to your body. Roman soldiers developed chronic back pain, hip pain, knee problems, worn down joints. Your spine curved forward from the weight. Your shoulders hunched. The bones in your feet flattened. You became a creature shaped by burden. And you smelled badly. There was no way to clean armor easily. Sweat soaked the leather straps. The inside of the helmet was a stew of oil, rust, and old hair. The wool tunic under your armor. Rarely washed. Often reused. Infested with lice. On rainy days, the metal rusted. On hot days, it scalded your skin. On snowy days, it froze to your limbs. There was no season in which Roman armor was pleasant. And yet, every piece served a purpose. The segmented plates deflected blades. The helmet absorbed arrows. The shield could form a wall against enemies. The sword stabbed between ribs. It all worked. Just not comfortably. Over time, your body adapted. Your shoulders toughened. Your back adjusted. Your neck thickened to support the helmet. But the aches never went away. They became part of you. Like your armor. Like your scars. Like the endless weight. So when you saw a Roman soldier standing tall and shining metal on a battlefield, remember that shine came from hours of polishing. That armor weighed him down. It bruised his ribs. It scarred his shoulders. It shaped his life. It was not a costume. It was a prison. And he wore it every day. The average Roman soldier spent far more time walking than fighting. If you thought being in the army meant action, glory, or drama, you were sorely mistaken. It mostly meant marching. Marching from one forgotten place to another. Across valleys. Through swamps. Up mountains. Down into riverbeds. Through enemy territory you weren't even sure was enemy territory. On a typical day, you'd wake up before dawn. Still half asleep. Still soaked in yesterday's sweat. You'd strap on your armor, which by now smelled like old cheese and iron. Your cloak would be damp. Your boots, stiff from yesterday's mud. The centurion would blow the horn, and off you'd go. Another 20 miles. Maybe more. It wasn't a leisurely stroll. A Roman legion marched at about 4 miles per hour. Faster than a modern hiker with a backpack. But your pack wasn't just a backpack. It was a weapon rack, a kitchen, a shelter, and a wardrobe all in one. About 60 to 90 pounds, slung over your shoulder with a yoke called a furca. Imagine dragging your house behind you. Every footstep was measured. In fact, Romans were obsessed with measurements. A day's march was measured in millia passum, thousands of double paces. 20 Roman miles a day. Rain or shine. Sick or healthy. Blisters or blood. There were no sick days for the feet. The road was not always paved. Even though Roman roads are legendary, many were uneven, broken, or not roads at all. Just dirt paths trodden by carts. Covered in dung. Slick with clay. Full of ankle-twisting holes. You'd march in full formation. 6 abreast. Keeping pace. No wandering off. No stopping for a drink. You learned to pee while walking. Or not at all. The discipline was absolute. Sometimes the weather was brutal. Under a burning sun, you baked inside your armor. The metal plates seared your skin. Sweat poured down your back and turned your tunic into a sponge. Your sandals rubbed your feet raw. And there were no stops for hydration. You drank when you could. If your water ran out, too bad. You marched thirsty. When it rained, everything was worse. The roads turned into rivers of sludge. Your pack became twice as heavy. Your armor rusted as you wore it. The rain ran into your boots, squelching with every step. Visibility dropped. Morale sank. You couldn't stop. If you slipped, someone behind you trampled you. In snow, your limbs went numb. Your breath turned to mist. Your sandals offered no insulation. You were cold, wet, and sore. Every part of your body hurt, and still the miles stretched on. Sometimes, you didn't even know where you were going. Orders came from above. Go east. Go north. Guard a border. Quell a rebellion. You followed orders blindly. Days blurred into weeks. You forgot what dry feet felt like. At the end of the day, you didn't get to rest. You got to build a camp. That's right, after marching 20 miles, your next job was construction. The Roman military camp was not a casual affair. It had to be square. It had to be fortified. It had to be defensible. That meant digging a ditch, fossa, around the perimeter. Then using the dirt to build a rampart, agger. Then placing sharpened stakes, vam, on top. Every man had to dig. No excuses. You'd grab your entrenching tool, a short-handled pick or shovel, and go to work. In armor. In mud. In darkness, sometimes. The earth was often hard, rocky, or soaked. Blisters formed on top of blisters. Once the camp's defenses were built, then you could pitch your tent. Except your tent was not a modern pop-up shelter. It was made of heavy leather, often goat or cowhide, sewn together and stretched over wooden poles. It stank. It leaked. You shared it with 7 other soldiers. Inside, there was no bedding. Just earth. Sometimes mud. You laid your cloak down and curled up in it, still damp from your own sweat and the previous night's storm. You slept shoulder to shoulder, sometimes even on top of one another, depending on space. Your armor was your pillow. Your shield was your mattress. Dinner was basic. Usually boiled grain or pulse, a thick porridge made from whatever was on hand. If you were lucky, there was a bit of meat. Maybe a hard biscuit. If you were really lucky, a splash of sour wine to wash it down. And then sleep. For a few hours. Until your watch began. That's right, you took turns guarding the camp. Even after a full day of marching and digging. You'd patrol the perimeter. Watch the shadows. Stare into the trees and wonder if you'd make it to morning. And then, when the sun rose, it all began again. Pack up. Tear down the tent. Fill in the ditch. Strap on your gear. And march. Again. Day after day. Week after week. Sometimes for years. Through Germania. Through Britain. Through Africa. The miles stretched endlessly behind, and endlessly ahead. You couldn't complain. If you did, you were whipped. Or beaten. Or forced to carry extra weight. Or dig extra ditches. Discipline was enforced with pain. Comrades who broke rank might be punished in front of everyone. Humiliation was routine. And so you learned to keep marching. To keep digging. To keep suffering. It became your life. Not glamorous. Not heroic. Just mud. Miles. And misery. That was the true experience of a Roman soldier. Not charging into battle with gleaming armor and a war cry. But trudging through rain. Carrying 70 pounds of gear. Digging a trench with bloody hands. Sleeping in wet leather. And waking up to do it all over again. And the worst part. You didn't even know when it would end. You served for 25 years. If you lived that long. If disease didn't take you. If the weather didn't kill you. If exhaustion didn't wear you down to nothing. But the marching never stopped. Nor did the mud. That was the Roman military machine. Not fast. Not glamorous. Just relentless. Before you were ever allowed to march in formation or swing a sword at an enemy, you had to endure Roman military training. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't fun. It was repetition. Grueling repetition. And pain. Lots and lots of pain. The Roman army didn't care about your feelings. Or your past. Or what you thought you knew. The moment you were recruited or conscripted, your life was no longer your own. You belonged to the legion. And the legion demanded discipline. Physical toughness. Mental obedience. And a complete surrender to the will of your commanders. Training began at dawn. Every day. There were no breaks. No Sundays off. The idea was simple, turn soft peasants into hardened killing machines. The method. Pain and repetition. Your first and most basic drill was marching. You didn't just walk. You marched in step. In formation. 4 hours. Around the parade ground. In circles. In columns. In silence. If anyone fell out of step, the whole unit started again. You were punished as a group. So you learned to hate the weakest among you. And to help them too. Then came running. You ran in armor. You ran with your shield. You ran with your pack. You ran up hills. Through mud. In the summer heat. In the winter wind. And if you fell behind, the centurion screamed your name, and made you run extra laps. Then came weapons training. You practiced with a wooden sword, Rudy's, that was deliberately heavier than a real gladius. Twice as heavy. 3 times, sometimes. You weren't learning finesse. You were building strength. Swing after swing. into wooden posts, called pila. Not real enemies, not yet. Just unyielding wooden stumps. You struck until your shoulders burned. Until your wrists ached. Until blisters tore open. Then the javelin. Not once, but dozens of times. Repetitive throws at wooden targets. The pilum wasn't light, and the arm motion had to be precise. Throwing wrong meant breaking the weapon. Or worse, missing the kill. Your instructor noticed everything. And punished everything. Then the shield. The heavy rectangular scutum. You held it for hours. In one arm. Blocking phantom attacks. Learning to strike from behind its bulk. It was like sparring while hiding behind a door. Awkward. Exhausting. Necessary. You trained in pairs. In squads. In centuries. You trained for individual combat. Then team combat. Then formation fighting. The testudo formation. The wedge. The hollow square. All choreographed like a brutal dance. If one man fell out of position, the whole thing collapsed. And when your body could take no more, they drilled your mind. You memorized commands. Repeated them. Obeyed without question. The centurion barked in Latin. And you moved instantly. You didn't ask, why? That wasn't your place. Thinking got you hurt. Obedience kept you alive. You practiced building camps. Over and over. Digging ditches. Raising palisades. Setting up tents. Tearing them down. Doing it again. No matter the weather. No matter how tired you were. Because one day, it wouldn't be practice. It would be survival. You learned to swim in armor. To cross rivers. To climb walls. To build bridges. You weren't just a soldier. You were a construction crew. A scout. A laborer. You had to be everything. Because the Roman army didn't wait for specialists. Everyone did everything. Injuries were common. But they didn't excuse you. A twisted ankle meant you trained on one leg. A cut hand meant you switched arms. Bruises, sprains, cracked ribs, these were part of daily life. Rest was for the dead. Or the dishonored. There was no praise. Only silence or correction. If your form was perfect, they said nothing. If it was wrong, they shouted. Or struck you. The vine stick, vitis, was always ready. Carried by the centurion like a badge of punishment. Disobedience. That meant flogging. Or worse, fustuarium, beating by your own comrades until you died. Cowardice was contagious. The Romans stamped it out early. Weeks passed. Then months. The new recruits became lean. Their soft hands became calloused. Their backs straightened. Their eyes hardened. The training broke you, then rebuilt you. And even when you became a full legionary, the training never stopped. When not marching, or fighting, you drilled. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. A Roman soldier trained until retirement. Or death. There was no ceremony. No graduation. Just the silent nod of approval. A new assignment. A march to the frontier. And more drills. Because the Roman army didn't win through cleverness or inspiration. It won through discipline. Through endless, painful, numbing repetition. The enemy might have more spirit. More emotion. But they didn't have Roman training. And that was what conquered the world. When new recruits imagined battle, they often thought of glory. Clean sword fights. Heroic moments. Cheers of victory. But what they got instead was a screaming chaos of filth, pain, and confusion. Combat in the Roman army was nothing like the dreams they once carried. It was far worse. And infinitely more boring. Until it wasn't. The first shock came before the battle even started. You didn't just charge in. You waited. Hours. Sometimes days. The commanders met. Scouts returned. Signals were exchanged. And while you stood in formation under the hot sun or freezing wind, you had one job: wait. Your armor rubbed at your neck. Your helmet baked your scalp. Your legs cramped from standing still. All while your mind bounced between terror and boredom. You stared across the field, sometimes at thousands of screaming enemies, or sometimes at nothing. Just a line of trees hiding what you would soon meet. Then came the march. You didn't just run at the enemy. You advanced in formation. One step, then another. The shields formed a wall. Spears were angled out. You breathed in rhythm with the men around you. One voice shouted commands. One rhythm held the legion together. But even in formation, everything fell apart the moment combat began. The moment the front lines clashed, order shattered. You were no longer a clean part of a machine. You were just a man in a storm of blades and bodies. The noise was unbearable. Screams. Metal on metal. Bone snapping. The roar of thousands of voices, all trying to live one more second. You could barely hear your own heartbeat over the chaos. You didn't see your enemy clearly. Most of the time, you swung blindly, or stabbed at shapes that darted in and out of your view. Your shield blocked your left. Your neighbor's shield blocked your right. You saw only what was directly ahead, if that. The ground was a nightmare. Mud clung to your sandals. Blood mixed with dirt. Bodies fell beneath your feet. You might step on a corpse, or a severed limb, or a dying comrade. And you couldn't stop, because to stop was to die. You weren't dueling. You weren't dancing with an enemy. You were jabbing forward with your gladius, over and over, hoping it struck flesh. Hoping the man in front of you fell before you could stab back. You didn't fight for victory. You fought for the next breath. Time disappeared. A battle could last minutes, or hours. But inside it, you had no idea. The sun might shift in the sky, or clouds might roll in. But you wouldn't notice, because your whole world was narrowed to the patch of ground in front of you. And fear. Fear was constant. It wasn't just fear of dying. It was fear of losing your position, of failing your comrades, of disobeying a command, or of being seen as weak. The shame of breaking formation could be worse than death. Roman soldiers had been executed by their own legions for cowardice. That thought never left your mind. And then, suddenly, it would end. Maybe your side won. Maybe the enemy broke and ran. Or maybe your own side retreated. But the noise stopped. And you were left standing. Bloody. Bruised. Shaking. Or maybe you collapsed. Into the muck. Onto the bodies. Hoping someone would drag you back. Or leave you there. Many soldiers bled out unnoticed. Trampled in the retreat. Buried in the mud. After battle came the aftermath. Not celebration. Not feasting. But cleanup. You searched for your comrades. Some missing limbs. Some missing altogether. You dragged bodies. Dug graves. Burned what you couldn't bury. And if you lost, you ran. Or hid. Or surrendered. And prayed the enemy spared you. And in all of this, you wondered, why? For what? Land you'd never own. A general you'd never meet. A victory you might not live to see. The Romans didn't fight for personal gain. They fought because they were told to. Because disobedience was death. Because the army moved as one. And you had no choice. The reality of combat was not heroism. It was confusion, panic, pain, and survival. Roman soldiers didn't live for battle. They endured it, survived it, and dreaded the next one. Because the next one was always coming. For all the tales of glory and blood-soaked battles, the truth is that Roman soldiers spent far more time marching than fighting. Endless miles. Endless steps. Across every kind of terrain. Through rain, dust, cold, and heat. Marching wasn't just transportation. It was a way of life. And it was as boring as it was brutal. When you joined the Roman legions, You quickly discovered that your feet would carry you farther than any horse. Roman armies were famous for their mobility, but not because they had great transport. No, it was because they had soldiers trained to march up to 30 kilometers a day, often more. And they did it carrying half their body weight in gear. Every soldier was loaded down like a human mule. You carried your armor, shield, sword, dagger, food rations, water, shovel, cooking tools, tent pole, and any other assigned burden. This load could easily weigh 40 to 50 kilograms. There were no carts to help you. If you were lucky, maybe a donkey. But mostly, it was your back and your legs. The result: blisters, sores, feet swollen beyond recognition. Sandals offered little comfort. They were open. They let in pebbles, dirt, and water. The leather straps rubbed your skin raw. Marches turned your feet into mangled slabs of pain. And the roads. Roman roads were marvels of engineering. Straight, reliable, but not gentle. Hard stone beneath your feet offered no softness, just relentless pounding. On hot days, the sun turned the stones into ovens. On wet days, the paths were slippery and treacherous. In the mountains, they zigzagged endlessly. In the forests, they disappeared into muck. The worst part: marches often started before dawn. You'd wake in the dark, roll up your tent, eat some hard bread, shoulder your pack, and begin walking. 4 hours. With few breaks. You walked until your knees ached, until your calves burned, until your head throbbed from dehydration. If you lagged behind, the punishment was swift. Roman discipline didn't allow for stragglers. Centurions kept a close eye. A man who fell out of line might be beaten, or worse, left behind. Weakness was not tolerated. You marched, or you died. And marching wasn't just about getting from place to place. It was a test of endurance. A daily trial. The generals believed that tired feet built strong warriors. So they kept the legions moving, even when there was nowhere urgent to go. Training marches. Punishment marches. Marches just to show off Roman discipline to nearby tribes. And at the end of the day, no rest, no hammock. You didn't just collapse. You built camp. Every night, the soldiers had to construct a temporary fortress. Trenches were dug. Ramparts were built. Tents were erected in neat rows. Guards were posted. And only then, maybe, you could eat. That meant more digging, more lifting, more sweat, even when your legs were shaking from the day's walk. The Romans called this labor, work. And they did it without question, without hesitation, because the army was not a democracy. It was a machine, and you were one cog in that machine. Some soldiers tried to ease the pain. They stuffed cloth inside their sandals. They wrapped their feet in rags. They chewed herbs to dull the pain. Others sang marching songs to keep rhythm, to distract from the pain, to forget the endless miles ahead. But there was no real relief. No solution. Just acceptance. You marched because there was no other choice. And when your sandals wore out, you made new ones. When your toes bled, you kept walking. When your joints throbbed, you pressed on. Over time, your feet hardened. Your muscles grew stronger. Your mind became numb to the agony. Not because it got easier, but because your body gave up resisting. Pain became the new normal. And boredom, the crushing sameness of each mile, was something you had to live with. Some days it rained. Your cloak clung to your skin. Your pack grew heavier with water. Your feet squished in soaked sandals. Other days the sun blazed. Sweat poured into your eyes. The dust choked your breath. You could go weeks without proper washing. You smelled like every step you took. You saw the same backs in front of you, heard the same footsteps behind you. Day after day, the scenery changed, but the rhythm did not. It was monotony with a side of suffering. Sometimes you passed villages. The locals watched you from behind fences. Some stared in awe, some in fear, others in pity, because they saw not warriors, but worn-down men on a never-ending road. Eventually, you reached your destination. A battlefield, a fort, a border outpost. But your relief was brief. Because you knew, after a few days or weeks, you would march again. To somewhere else. Through mountains, deserts, forests, or swamps. That was the life of a Roman soldier. Not glorious battles. Not speeches before charging into history. But mile after mile. On roads built by men like you. Pounded flat by sandals worn thin. Toward places you didn't choose. For causes you didn't understand. Marching forward. Always forward. Until one day, your legs gave out. Or your orders stopped. Or your time ran out. And only then did the marching end. If you've ever had a bad meal and thought, this tastes like something from a battlefield, you might be closer to the truth than you think. The average Roman soldier's diet was not just unappetizing. It was aggressively boring. The kind of food that would make you lose interest in eating altogether. Not because you were full, but because every bite reminded you that taste, joy, and satisfaction had long since marched away. Let's begin with the staple, bread. It was the Roman soldier's most reliable and most unremarkable companion. Bread was eaten with nearly every meal. Not the fluffy, soft kind you might imagine. No, this was a dense, chewy, tooth-breaking slab of dough known as panis militaris. It was baked in large round loaves, sometimes as hard as rock if made in advance and left out too long. It could last for days, or even weeks, without molding. Mostly because it was so dry, even bacteria didn't want it. Soldiers soaked it in water or wine just to soften it enough not to break a tooth. And that brings us to wine. Roman military wine was not the kind that makes you swirl a glass and remark on notes of berry or subtle oakiness. No, it was sour, low quality, and watered down on purpose. They called it posca, a mix of vinegar, old wine, and water. It was meant to be disinfectant more than drink. A way to kill germs in the water, not to lift your spirits. Most soldiers hated it at first, but over time, like everything else, they got used to it. It was sour. It was bitter. And after a long day of marching, it was all you had. Sometimes it tasted like feet. Sometimes worse. But it was wet. And it filled your stomach. Alongside bread and posca, there was pulse. A sort of barley porridge or gruel. Made from crushed grains, boiled in water, sometimes with a few vegetables thrown in. No spice. No flavor. Just a gray, lumpy paste served hot or cold. It was cheap, easy to cook over a campfire, and absolutely uninspired. Some soldiers added garlic or onions for variety. Most didn't even bother. You could chew it or drink it depending on how thin it was. Either way, it didn't make much of a difference. It slid down the throat and sat in the stomach like a sack of wet gravel. Protein was rare. Meat was a luxury. Occasionally, soldiers received salted pork or dried beef, often so tough it needed to be boiled for hours. Eggs, cheese, and beans were more common but still not guaranteed. When available, fish was often dried and salted beyond recognition. The result was food that stank of brine and crumbled when touched. Still, it was food. And it kept you alive. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal and inconsistent. Apples, figs, lentils, and cabbages appeared when the army was near farms or supplied by ships. But for long campaigns in the wilderness, especially in the cold or mountainous regions, fresh food disappeared. Everything was dried, smoked, or pickled. You chewed what you could, swallowed the rest, and moved on. But the worst enemy of the Roman soldier's diet wasn't the taste. It was monotony. Day after day, the same ingredients, the same preparations, the same meager rations. Hunger never fully went away. Most soldiers were underfed relative to the energy they burned. Marching 30 kilometers a day while hauling 40 kilos takes a toll. But the Roman military calculated just enough food to keep you functional, not satisfied. Not happy. Just functional. Food distribution followed strict patterns. Rations were portioned by contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers sharing a tent. They cooked together, ate together, and complained together. One man might be in charge of grinding the grain. Another collected firewood. A third stirred the pot. It was an operation, not a meal. If you failed your part, your tentmates went hungry. There was no room for laziness. And certainly no room for culinary experimentation. When a campaign moved quickly or when supply lines were cut, soldiers had to forage or scavenge. That meant eating wild plants, roots, or whatever animals they could catch. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to boil weeds into soup, or roast beetles, birds, or lizards when desperate. Some even ate leather, belts, shoes, boiled and chewed to soften. Hunger bends the imagination. It forces the stomach to accept what the tongue would normally reject. In winter, things got worse. Fires were hard to maintain. Water froze. Dried bread became harder still. Meals shrank in size and warmth. A soldier's day might begin with a bite of frozen grain cake. It might end with cold wine and a few lentils. The body withered, slowly but surely. Scurvy and malnutrition loomed just out of view, creeping in during long campaigns without citrus or greens. Food boredom was more than a mild complaint. It chipped away at morale. When your only joy is a dry biscuit and bitter drink, your world becomes flat. Conversation dried up. Tempers flared. Soldiers fought not just over politics or pay, but over someone stealing an onion or hiding a few extra beans. Tiny culinary betrayals could cause massive tension. Because when you live on gruel, every scrap is sacred. Despite all this, the army persisted. Meals were predictable, reliable, and that gave some comfort. In a world of war, disease, marching, and death, at least you knew what was in your bowl. Even if it wasn't good. Even if it wasn't enough. Even if it tasted like defeat. In truth, Roman soldiers didn't expect variety. They didn't dream of feasts. They weren't waiting for roast boar, or sweet figs or spiced sauces. Those were for the generals. For the aristocrats. The men who gave orders, not followed them. The best a legionary could hope for was a good batch of grain. Maybe a fresh goat. Or a festival that brought better supplies. Occasionally, there were bonuses, extra rations after a victory. But they were rare, fleeting, and soon followed by more of the same old barley stew. Food wasn't pleasure. It was survival. A slow, dull rhythm of chewing and swallowing. Like marching, it was repetitive. Unchanging. Day after day, you fed the machine of your body just enough to keep it moving. Just enough to wake up tomorrow. Just enough to march again. And again. And again. So when you picture the glory of the Roman Empire, the towering columns and marble statues, the generals on horseback giving orders with the sun behind them, don't forget the real foundation of that empire. The men in the mud, spooning gray gruel into their mouths, chewing bread like brick, sipping vinegar wine from clay cups. That was the diet of empire. Not decadent. Not exotic. Just enough. Always just enough. When you think of the Roman soldier, your first thought is likely not one of leisure. And rightly so. The Roman army was a machine designed for conquest and control, not relaxation. Every soldier was a cog in that system, and cogs don't get time off. They spin. They grind. They break. And only sometimes do they get a moment to be still. Technically, Roman soldiers were granted free time. But the term, free, was flexible, more a suggestion than a right. A soldier's day was packed with routine, marching drills, weapon training, latrine duties, guard shifts, meal preparation, and kit maintenance. By the time all the necessary work was done, What little was left was free time in name only. You were still expected to stay near camp, still expected to be ready at a moment's notice. Even at rest, you were under watch. So what did Roman soldiers do when they weren't stabbing, marching, or sweating? The answer is, not much. And whatever they did do had to be quiet, cheap, and simple. There were no books for most. Literacy wasn't common among legionaries. There were no radios, no phones, no streaming services to pass the time. Just your fellow soldiers, the hard ground beneath you, and the occasional carved bone dice. Gambling was, perhaps, the most widespread form of entertainment. Soldiers used coins, pebbles, or even scraps of food to place bets on games of dice. The games themselves were simple, many of them resembling modern backgammon or basic chance rolls. But the stakes felt real. A day's ration could be lost. A week's pay gone in a few throws. Gambling was technically illegal in the army except during festivals, but the rule was enforced inconsistently. Commanders looked the other way as long as things stayed peaceful. But fights over games were common, and sometimes deadly. Singing and storytelling were other favored pastimes. Around the campfire, legionaries swapped tales, sometimes real, sometimes exaggerated. Ghost stories were popular, especially when stationed far from Rome in misty forests or unfamiliar terrain. Soldiers told stories about strange local spirits, curses, and haunted battlefields. Sometimes they laughed at each other. Sometimes they wept. And occasionally, a story would get passed from unit to unit until it became legend. If you had a musical talent, your free time might include playing a lyre, flute, or even a drum. Instruments were often handmade, or traded from locals. Music in the camp was both distraction and morale booster. It helped drown out the silence that came after a long march. And it reminded soldiers, however briefly, that beauty still existed somewhere beyond their dusty boots and worn-out tunics. For those lucky enough to be stationed near a town or city, the options expanded slightly. Soldiers on leave might visit a tavern to drink, gamble, or listen to performers. Sometimes they hired the services of entertainers, dancers, musicians, or gladiators. If a unit was near a Roman colony, they could even visit a public bath, enjoy a hot soak, and socialize. These moments were rare luxuries. And not every soldier could afford them. Most of the time, leisure was confined to the perimeter of a cold, cramped tent. Writing letters was another way soldiers spent their limited downtime, at least, those who could read and write. A small percentage of soldiers were literate, and those who weren't might pay a literate comrade to compose their thoughts. Letters were usually short and filled with longing. Soldiers asked after parents, sent messages to wives or sweethearts, and sometimes wrote about the weather, their health, or their hunger. Letters were precious things. Not just for their contents, but for what they represented, a thin lifeline to a home that felt increasingly far away. Then there were mock battles. These were technically training exercises, but to the soldiers, they were often a form of sport. Practice duels, wrestling matches, and formation drills could become competitive. Victors earned bragging rights. Losers sometimes earned bruises. There was camaraderie in these contests, and they often doubled as performance art. Men laughed, cheered, and heckled from the sidelines. It wasn't exactly entertainment, but it was something. And in the brutal routine of army life, something was better than nothing. Despite these few outlets, boredom was a constant companion. Unlike modern armies with structured recreational programs, Roman soldiers were left largely to their own devices. And when there were no devices, no books, no cards, no screens, what remained was often silence. Silence and the sound of breathing men who all dreamed of being somewhere else. Some tried to escape boredom through craftwork. Soldiers carved wood, shaped leather, or made charms and amulets. These items were often traded among comrades or gifted to locals. A soldier might carve a goddess into bone, string together colored beads, or whittle a figurine from a scrap of firewood. It wasn't just to pass time, it was to create a mark, a moment, something personal in a life of sameness. It was also, in a way, therapy. Over time, many soldiers became deeply introspective. There wasn't much else to do but think. For some, this meant wrestling with regrets. For others, it was remembering the farm, the mother, or the street they left behind. Long evenings invited reflection, and some soldiers, too tired to talk, simply sat and stared at the fire. Not sad, not happy, just numb. There were festivals. Saturnalia, for example, brought brief joy. Celebrated in December, it allowed soldiers to take a break, wear civilian clothing, exchange gifts, and even elect a mock king of the camp for a day of controlled misrule. It was chaotic, but joyous. A tiny slice of Roman culture brought into the rigid order of army life. But such events were few, and the return to duty was always immediate. Punishment for misusing free time was harsh. Soldiers caught sneaking off, gambling during restricted hours, or brawling could be whipped, fined, or demoted. Free time came with unspoken rules: don't get drunk, don't get loud, don't forget you're a soldier. Even at rest, discipline had to be absolute. You didn't really relax, you merely paused. In truth, the most honest form of entertainment a Roman soldier had was sleep. Not because it was luxurious, but because it was the only time you weren't expected to do anything. It was a relief to lie down, however hard the ground, however thin the blanket. In those moments, between fatigue and rest, a man could almost pretend he was free. Not a cog, not a sword, just a body, drifting. And so the brutal monotony of the Roman military was endured in brief glimpses of distraction. A dice game, a joke, a carved figure of Mars, a song hummed half-heartedly by a man watching the stars. These were the amusements of empire, not grand, not glorious, but quietly human. And in that quiet, the Roman soldier found the only entertainment the army truly allowed: survival. For the average Roman soldier, the beginning of your military service was often marked by a firm handshake and the slow, grim realization that your life was no longer your own. Enlistment wasn't a temporary phase or a trial year. It was a commitment. 25 years. That's what the Roman state demanded. A quarter of a century. More than enough time to lose your youth, your teeth, your hearing, and your sense of peace. 25 years was a cruel number in a brutal profession. Most men didn't make it to the end. Disease, wounds, accidents, or the sheer strain of living as a tool of conquest ensured that many soldiers never lived to see retirement. The Roman army didn't hand out early pensions for burnout or back problems. You served until your name was scratched from the rolls, either because you were discharged, or because your body was burned or buried. Those who did survive to retirement weren't greeted with parades or golden wreaths. What they received, usually, was land or a cash payment, depending on the era and emperor. In the early empire, Augustus popularized the idea of cash retirement bonuses, around 3,000 denarii at one point, later rising to 5,000. On paper, this was a generous parting gift. In practice, it was the bare minimum required to ensure veterans didn't revolt. Land grants were a bit trickier. Many soldiers were given plots in newly conquered territories, remote, undeveloped, and far from their place of birth. The logic was simple: reward the veteran, populate the province, and stabilize the frontier. But the life of a soldier turned farmer was no picnic. You went from digging trenches to digging ditches, from fighting enemies to fighting weeds, from one kind of hardship to another. And that's assuming your paperwork went through. Retirement, like much else in the Roman state, was wrapped in red tape and bureaucracy. Veterans often waited months, sometimes years, for their rewards to be processed. Mistakes in records could delay or deny your bonus entirely. And there were few avenues to appeal. Your centurion was no longer your commanding officer. Your sword was no longer a source of influence. You were just an old man with a limp, begging for your due. Some veterans were offered the option of re-enlisting in auxiliary roles: trainers, guards, clerks. These roles came with fewer expectations, but also less prestige and, often, more tedium. Others took up manual labor, hired themselves out as mercenaries, or returned to family homes only to find that the world had moved on without them. 25 years was long enough for parents to die, siblings to scatter, and old sweethearts to marry someone else. Not all who retired became bitter or broken. Some managed to carve out lives of modest peace. They built homes, raised families, and told stories to their children about the time they crossed the Danube or marched through Gaul. Roman society held veterans in reasonably high regard. They were symbols of loyalty and endurance. But admiration didn't fill bellies or mend worn-out knees. Death, however, was a far more common form of discharge. It was never heroic the way marble statues suggested. Soldiers died in ditches. They died of fever. They died in winter when their cloaks were too thin. They drowned crossing rivers. They were trampled in stampedes. Their ends were often quick and unceremonious. For those who died in battle, burial might be hasty. A shallow grave if the unit had time. Cremation if the body could be retrieved. If not, they were left on the field. Picked over by scavengers, mourned only in silence. Names were inscribed on tablets if they were lucky. Forgotten if they were not. No trumpets. No folded flags. Just the end. Some soldiers prepared for this outcome. They saved what they could. Hid coins in their boots. Paid friends to promise to bury them properly. Death was expected. Not feared, exactly, just accepted. An occupational hazard. Like blisters, lice, or getting screamed at by your centurion. The emotional toll of service rarely showed in official records. But it's likely that many veterans suffered what we would now call post-traumatic stress. Years of killing, marching, and sleeping with your sword likely warped a man's soul. There were no counselors. No therapy dogs. No one to talk to who wasn't also scarred. You either found peace in drink, silence, or religion. Or you didn't. Roman society had mixed feelings about aging soldiers. Some admired them. Others pitied them. The young saw them as relics. Shopkeepers overcharged them. Priests blessed them. And politicians used them. In times of political turmoil, veterans were a valuable political force, loyal, armed, and angry. Emperors made sure to pay them off to avoid revolt. But when peace returned, veterans faded into the background. Forgotten again. And yet, despite all this, many Roman men still volunteered. Some were drawn by pay. Others by the promise of land. Some by patriotism, real or imagined. But perhaps most of all, they were drawn by the fact that civilian life offered little else. If you were poor, landless, and without prospects, the army gave you purpose. A uniform. A wage. A future, however uncertain. In the end, the Roman soldier's journey always narrowed to two roads. Retirement. Or death. Both carried scars. Both left the soul altered. And both were reminders that the cost of empire was not paid in marble or silver. It was paid in lives stretched thin across the years, bent under discipline, dulled by repetition, and eventually broken by time. Retirement or death, the only ways out of the ranks. The life of a Roman soldier did not end with the final battle or the last march. It often ended with a quiet shuffle into obscurity. Once the armor was hung up and the weapons dulled, the reality of civilian life crept in, slowly, and often without mercy. The Roman veteran was not a figure of triumph, garlanded in glory. More often, he was a man out of place, out of time, and increasingly out of mind. At first, there was relief. No more drills at dawn. No more blisters from the miles of marching. No more barking orders or sleepless nights in freezing tents. The veteran could sleep in his own bed. Eat warm food. Feel the sun on his face without a helmet weighing down his neck. These small freedoms tasted sweet. But they didn't last. Because the world didn't slow down for a man who had served. And life outside the Legion was not built to accommodate the ones who returned broken. Many veterans were offered land upon their discharge. This, in theory, was a reward for service. In reality, the land was often poor in quality or difficult to defend. These plots were on the fringes of the empire, hot, dry, rocky stretches in Hispania or frigid outposts in the northern provinces. The Roman state saw this as a strategic placement. Populate the borders with trained warriors, and maybe they'd hold back the barbarians. But for the soldier who had just spent 25 years dodging spears and digging latrines, starting over on a patch of stubborn earth was no victory. And then came the silence. A legionary was used to noise. The clash of shields, the murmur of orders, the steady rhythm of footfalls on Roman roads. In retirement, the silence pressed in like a new kind of enemy. Some veterans tried to drown it with alcohol. Others with prayer. Others simply grew quiet, speaking little, keeping their memories folded away like old tunics they didn't want to wear again. The past stayed in their bones, though. Every aching joint told a story. Every scar whispered of someone who hadn't made it. Their communities didn't always know what to do with them. Some veterans returned to villages that barely remembered their names. Young men saw them as relics. Children were told to respect them, but few listened. These were not shining knights or noble champions. These were weathered old men with crooked fingers and bad tempers. Men who had lived too long in tents and too far from softness. They were foreign even in their own homeland. A few tried to keep busy. They worked as guards for merchants or local officials. Some were hired to train militias, or act as muscle for landowners. But these jobs paid poorly and offered little dignity. Others simply took to farming, digging soil instead of trenches, building fences instead of forts. They did what they could. But the body, after decades of punishment, didn't cooperate. Bad knees. Failing eyesight. Shaking hands. The soldier who could once run 20 miles in chainmail now struggled to lift a bucket of water. Time did not reward their loyalty. Rome was vast and busy. The empire rolled forward. New recruits joined. New wars began. Emperors rose and fell. And the veteran, once part of this mighty engine, became a fading echo in the distance. The state did not follow up. There was no health care. No pension checks arriving monthly. If you fell ill, you relied on family or the local gods. And if they didn't help, well, then you slipped quietly into the shadows. Even burial was uncertain. Soldiers who had once fought under golden standards were sometimes buried in shallow graves with no markings. Others were lucky enough to join veteran communities, small settlements where former legionaries lived and died together. These places offered some comfort. Shared stories. Shared meals. Shared ghosts. But they were small flickers in an empire that preferred to focus on glory, not aftermath. Some veterans received minor honors. A bronze diploma engraved with their service record. A mention in a city registry. Perhaps a small statue if they had risen in rank or earned notable distinctions. But these were rare. Most died without fanfare. No eulogies. No trumpets. Just another name lost to the sands of time. And yet, despite the hardship, many veterans remained loyal. Rome had been cruel, but it had also been their identity. They had worn its eagle on their chest, carried its standard into chaos. Even in pain, even in poverty, they clung to that identity. They told stories of their service to anyone who would listen. They taught their sons discipline, their daughters pride. They were broken, but they were still Roman. And in a strange way, that mattered more than the scars. The veteran's life was not dramatic. It was slow, fading, uneventful. And that perhaps was the hardest part. A man who had once stood in formation with 10,000 others, who had marched across continents, now spent his days tending goats, or watching the clouds pass. There was no final battle. No chance to go out in a blaze of glory. Just the slow dimming of a fire that had once burned bright. And as the years passed, they were remembered less and less. New generations filled the legions. New wars captured the public's imagination. Old soldiers became old problems. Until, one by one, they disappeared. And the empire, relentless and unfeeling, continued marching without them. That was the veterans' final campaign. Not one of blood and steel, but of memory and meaning. Trying to matter in a world that had already moved on. Fighting not for Rome, but against invisibility. The last battle, silent, lonely, and slowly lost. The clash of weapons and chaos of battle often define the image of a Roman soldier. But in truth, most of a legionary's life was spent waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for the next campaign. Between the marches and the fighting, there were long stretches of quiet, filled not with glory but with repetition. When off duty, Roman soldiers lived lives of numbing predictability. Days were organized, strictly regimented, and almost entirely devoid of excitement. It was not thrilling, it was routine. And routine, day after day, is a strange kind of slow punishment. In camp, each soldier had a defined place and a defined role. Order was essential to maintain discipline and security. After all, a Roman camp wasn't just a resting place, it was a fortress. Walls were built, ditches dug, gates placed with precise orientation. Every day, even when no threat was in sight, there were duties to perform. Latrines had to be cleaned. Cooking fires tended. Equipment inspected and re-inspected. Time was broken into slots, morning inspections, drills, meals, watch shifts. Even recreation had a time and place. In the name of discipline, every moment was accounted for. Boredom in a Roman fort was dangerous. A restless legionary could become a problem. To keep soldiers occupied, commanders often kept schedules packed. Endless drills, even when there was no threat. Rehearsing battle formations under the hot sun. Practicing with weapons they had used for decades. It wasn't about skill anymore, it was about keeping minds and muscles busy. Yet underneath it all was the crushing sameness. Every step on the parade ground echoed the one before. Every barked order blurred into the next. The days rolled forward, gray and indistinct. When not engaged in training or labor, soldiers found ways to pass the time. Gambling was rampant. Dice games, betting on races or animal fights, wagering over trivial competitions. Coins changed hands constantly. Some soldiers lost their entire savings on a bad throw. Others gambled away their equipment, and had to face their centurion in shame. For many, gambling wasn't just entertainment, it was the only thrill available. A flicker of risk in a world defined by monotony. Some men turned to drink. Wine was cheap, widely available, and often mixed with water or vinegar. Drunkenness was technically frowned upon, especially on duty, but off-duty hours provided loopholes. After long days of labor and boredom, many sought the forgetfulness of drink. It numbed the body, dulled the mind, and softened the sharp edge of military life. But it also brought its own problems, fights, injuries, discipline issues. For the commanders, maintaining morale meant tolerating just enough vice, without letting it unravel the discipline. It was a delicate balance. Meals were another part of the unchanging rhythm. Soldiers ate basic rations, grain porridge, beans, onions, sometimes salted pork or cheese. The food was practical, not pleasurable. Each man received a set measure, and cooked it with his contubernium, an 8-man squad that shared a tent. These men became a second family. They argued, joked, and lived in close quarters for years. Yet even this familiarity could grow stale. Stories were told and retold until they lost all meaning. Laughter faded. And when silence set in, it lingered. For entertainment, soldiers sometimes attended games, or public performances if stationed near a town. Gladiator fights, plays, and festivals provided momentary escapes. But these were rare treats. Most of the time, a soldier's world was bounded by the walls of the camp. The view beyond was often bleak, barren fields, mountains, or forests full of people who hated Rome. A soldier could stare across a frontier for hours and see nothing but wind and dust. Letter writing offered some emotional outlet. Soldiers wrote home to wives, mothers, and children. They described their lives, asked for news, sent small gifts or money. But letters took weeks or months to arrive. Sometimes they never came at all. The longer a man served, the more distant his home became, not just in miles, but in memory. Relationships withered in silence. By the time a soldier returned, if he returned, his home might no longer be his. Time passed strangely in the camps. Days were long, but years vanished. One campaign bled into another. Men arrived, men died, men disappeared. New recruits came in, still wide-eyed and nervous. Old veterans watched them, remembered their own first days, and then went back to polishing armor that would never shine. Promotions came slowly. Discipline was constant. And behind it all was the ache of sameness, the weight of a life on repeat. Some tried to make sense of it. They carved small shrines in their tents, made offerings to Mars or Jupiter. They prayed for change, for survival, for something, anything, different. Others gave up entirely. They moved like ghosts through the routines, speaking only when spoken to. The army didn't need your spirit, just your body. And as long as you showed up, clean and information, no one cared if your eyes were empty. This was the daily life off duty for a Roman soldier. Not battle. Not heroism. Just long days filled with work, waiting, and a slow erosion of joy. The mind dulled. The heart hardened. And through it all, the empire marched on. Unchanged, unmoved, and uncaring. When we hear the phrase, Roman soldier, a flood of images comes to mind. Bronze helmets glinting in the Mediterranean sun. Red crests blowing in the wind. Formations of iron discipline, shields locked, javelins raised, orders shouted across a dusty battlefield. The marching columns of legionaries, their sandals pounding the stones of the Appian Way, seem timeless in popular memory. Their presence lingers in films, novels, paintings, and documentaries. We've mythologized them, sometimes as heroes of civilization, sometimes as brutal enforcers of empire. But what remains in memory is rarely what the soldiers themselves actually lived. And what the world forgets is often what defined them most. The Roman legionary of our imagination is a curated artifact. He is a clean-cut, grim-faced warrior standing tall beneath a golden eagle standard. He represents Rome's glory and discipline, a symbol of order in a chaotic world. But that image erases the dirt, the hunger, the fatigue. It scrubs away the boredom of camp life, and the silent terror of ambushes in dark forests. It ignores the long weeks of cold rain on the frontier, the trench foot, the lice, and the frostbite. What survives in the stories is a polished version, chiseled into stone or glorified in triumphal arches. Real soldiers, with their complaints, fears, injuries, and exhaustion, were rarely immortalized. History, as usual, preferred a cleaner narrative. When the emperors celebrated victory, it was not the common soldier's name they carved into monuments. Triumphs were awarded to generals and emperors, their faces etched in marble and currency. The soldiers were the machinery behind those victories, necessary, replaceable, and anonymous. They marched across provinces, bled in foreign lands, and died far from home. But their stories were largely unrecorded unless they happened to write letters that survived, or if they died in ways that made for good propaganda. Their identities were often erased by time, their graves simple and unnamed. Some soldiers tried to preserve their names on tombstones, carving into stone the years of service and the names of their units. But most were forgotten, folded into the larger machinery of Rome's expansion and myth. The myth of Roman military invincibility is one of the more persistent half-truths. Yes, Rome conquered a vast empire. But Roman soldiers were not invincible. They lost battles, many of them. The Taberg Forest saw entire legions annihilated, their eagles captured and buried as trophies by Germanic tribes. On the Parthian frontier, Roman lines crumbled under horse archers and scorching heat. Even within the empire, revolts sometimes caught Roman forces off guard. Yet these failures are often downplayed in popular memory. What lingers is the image of endless columns marching in perfect unison. But behind every victory, there was confusion, improvisation, and a lot of luck. Even their discipline, famous and brutal, has taken on mythic proportions. It's true that Roman commanders had immense control over their troops. But this control was often enforced through fear. Decimation, the punishment of executing every 10th man, was not a poetic metaphor. It was an actual policy, used sparingly but remembered vividly. Floggings, executions, and public humiliations were everyday tools of leadership. Soldiers didn't march so precisely just out of pride, they did it to avoid punishment. And that reality, grounded in pain and fear, is often glossed over in the romantic versions of the legion. Then there's the idea of loyalty. Roman soldiers were loyal to the empire, we are told. But the truth was more complicated. Many were loyal to their paymasters, to the general who shared their hardships, not the faceless senate or distant emperor. This personal loyalty made civil war all too common. Caesar's soldiers followed him across the Rubicon, not because they loved the Republic, but because he promised them land and wealth. Roman history is littered with marching legions used to settle political rivalries, not defend the homeland. So while the myth tells us of unity, the reality was often factionalism. And what of the soldiers themselves? Who were they? Not always Roman. Not always volunteers. Many were conscripts from conquered provinces, Gauls, Thracians, Syrians, Spaniards, serving under Latin-speaking officers. Others joined for money, or because they had nowhere else to go. Some were criminals offered freedom in exchange for military service. The legions were as diverse as the empire itself. Yet the myth tends to flatten them into a single identity: stoic, obedient, Roman. The real faces were more varied. The real accents more numerous. The real motivations more desperate. In literature and film, we often meet the Roman soldier as a figure of action. But very rarely do we meet him as a human being. The man with sore feet from weeks of marching. The man who hasn't seen his family in 20 years. The man who eats stale bread in the rain, scratching bug bites under his armor, wondering if the campaign will ever end. These moments rarely survive in the stories we tell. But they were the moments that defined a soldier's life. The quiet, aching minutes in between orders. The stretch of long silence after the noise of battle fades. These were the things that stayed with a man. Even in death, the memory of Roman soldiers has been reshaped. The tunes that remain speak of honor and duty, but they rarely speak of loneliness or regret. Some inscriptions were written not by comrades, but by military scribes. Many of the dead lay in mass graves, lost without name or record. A man might have served 20 years and never be remembered by anyone outside his unit. His sacrifice absorbed into a system that prized discipline over individuality. The myth might remember the Roman army, but it forgets the soldier. And yet, in small ways, their lives still echo. Archaeologists unearth their shoes, their tools, their half-written letters. We find fragments of their complaints, their jokes, even their graffiti scratched into stone walls. These glimpses, scattered and faint, offer something real. A name written on a piece of wood. A soldier's crude sketch of a horse. A note to a brother, asking for warm socks. These are not myths. They are traces of actual lives. Brief, unremarkable, and entirely human. So when we remember Roman soldiers, perhaps we should remember them less as symbols and more as people. People caught in a vast system, shaped by forces beyond their control. People who got up every morning not to become legends, but simply because they had to. People who endured routine, discomfort, and fear with little hope of reward. Their legacy isn't in triumphs or statues. It's in the silent endurance of ordinary men, asked to carry the weight of an empire. Not because they were brave, though many were, but because they had no other choice. And in that quiet persistence, they left a truth far deeper than any myth. There was a promise: whispered in dusty barracks and grumbled around campfires that one day the marching would stop. That after 20 or more years of service, if a man survived long enough, he would be released from his oath and rewarded. He would hang up his armor, trade his gladius for a plow, and live out the rest of his days under a peaceful sun. He would be given land, a piece of the empire he had bled for, and perhaps even Roman citizenship if he hadn't been born with it. To the weary foot soldier of the Roman legions, this dream became the distant shore after a lifetime of storms. But as with many things in history, the reality was far more complicated, and often, more bitter. The standard term of service for a Roman legionary varied throughout the centuries. Under Augustus, it was set at 16 years, later extended to 20 or even 25, depending on the period and military need. Auxiliary troops, non-citizens who filled the empire's ranks, often served even longer. These were long, hard years, marked by endless campaigns, manual labor, long-distance marches, and brutal punishment. Many never lived to see retirement. For those who did, the end of service often came with a piece of paper known as a diploma, inscribed in bronze, granting them their long-awaited discharge. This document could include promises of land, citizenship, or a cash payment, though the reliability of such promises varied wildly depending on politics, the location of the legion, and the ever-wobbling finances of the empire. Land was the most iconic and most unreliable of the retirement rewards. The promise of land had long been used as a recruitment tool, especially in the provinces. In theory, a soldier would be granted a small parcel in a Roman colony, fertile, peaceful, and safe. In practice, the empire's ability to deliver on that promise was deeply uneven. Sometimes a veteran would find that the land granted to him was not only remote and infertile, but also contested by local populations, who did not particularly want a Roman military presence settling nearby. Colonies were often planted like flags across conquered territories, strategic rather than comfortable. The idea was less to reward the soldier and more, to use him as an instrument of Romanization. He was expected to become a settler, to embody Roman values in far-flung regions, and to keep peace in areas where Roman authority was still fragile. Many of these veterans found that their final reward was little more than another posting. Yes, they were no longer under arms, but they were still expected to serve in a different capacity, as pillars of stability and order in regions that didn't always want them. Local uprisings, tax burdens, and poor harvests could turn retirement into a daily struggle. Moreover, the legal bureaucracy of the empire didn't always recognize or enforce land grants promptly. Delays, denials, and corruption were common. A veteran might spend years navigating courts, bribing officials, or appealing to governors for what he had already been promised on paper. Many died waiting. Others gave up and returned to their villages, or, worse, took to mercenary work just to survive. For some, especially those who served in elite units like the Praetorian Guard, retirement came with greater privileges. The Guard often received substantial bonuses, earlier discharge, and choice land around Rome or other key cities. But for the rank-and-file legionary or auxiliary, stationed in the Danube frontier or the Syrian desert, life after service was far more modest. A few veterans managed to carve out modest farms, pass down Roman citizenship to their children, and live relatively peaceful lives. But these were the exceptions that the myth remembers, not the rule that history shows. The psychological cost of retirement is often overlooked in Roman histories. These men had spent the better part of their lives following orders, sleeping in tents, marching in formation, and living within a rigid hierarchy. Suddenly removed from that structure, many struggled with the lack of routine and purpose. Some drifted, unable to reintegrate into civilian life. Others returned to soldiering in another form, becoming bodyguards, enforcers, or part of local militias. The trauma of violence, the long separation from family, and the sheer weight of years lived on campaign often left them emotionally unmoored. While the empire promised peace, it rarely offered support for healing. There are even records of veterans banding together, forming their own communities, villages populated almost entirely by ex-soldiers. In these enclaves, they recreated aspects of camp life, drills, communal meals, even Roman-style baths. These places became microcosms of the military world they had left behind, insulated from the civilian life they could never fully join. The empire may have considered their duty complete, but the soldiers themselves often felt like they were still caught in the long shadows of war. And then there were the veterans who simply faded. No land, no wealth, no family. Just a small pension if they were lucky, and the lingering aches of old wounds. These men might be buried quietly, without tombstones, without honors. No parades marked their final march. No crowds applauded their years of service. They passed from life to memory in silence, unnoticed by the empire they had once helped build. And so the myth of a glorious ending, of a peaceful villa and grandchildren at play, remained just that. A myth. The empire itself often used veterans as tools long after their discharge. Colonization projects, frontier stabilization, and even internal security often depended on these men. Their settlement in distant regions served strategic needs, projecting Roman culture and loyalty into territories still seen as unruly or dangerous. In this way, even in peace, the soldier's body and life remained instruments of the state. They were no longer expected to wield swords, but they were still expected to be Roman. To plant Roman ways, Roman gods, Roman laws, often on soil that didn't welcome them. A few veterans did become legends. Names like Lucius Vorenus or Titus Pullo, plucked from Caesar's writings or dramatized on screen, give the impression that soldierly valor could be immortalized. But for every one of them, there were thousands whose names vanished, whose children forgot their fathers' campaigns, whose graves were weathered down to nameless stones. The peaceful ending was not a grand chapter, it was often a lonely footnote. The final march didn't come with banners. It came quietly, and for many, unnoticed. In the end, the life of a Roman soldier was a long story of movement, of marching toward a goal that was often more imagined than real. They began in youth, hopeful or desperate, bound by oaths and orders. They passed through years of war, hardship, and routine. And when they emerged on the other side, if they did, what waited was rarely rest. Instead, it was a new kind of exile, exile from the life they had known, from the comrades who had died, from the world that had moved on without them. Their reward was not peace, but the challenge of finding meaning in a life no longer defined by orders and duty. And perhaps that is the most overlooked hardship of all.